So good morning. We started last week talking about our roles within the church, which is how I have chosen to approach the concept of spiritual gifts. That was part one. We talked about leadership roles, where some people really are just gifted in leading others in such areas as evangelism, or in teaching, or in pastoral care. Today, we're going to broaden it out to basically everyone, because, not everyone has a leadership ability, but everyone has a gift. But before I get directly into that, just to give you a heads up, we'll spend most of our session today in Romans 12 and 1 Corinthians 12. It just sort of worked out that way. Odd. But anyway, I would like to draw your attention to what should be a fairly familiar passage in Romans 12. The first two verses. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Right? This is a very popular set of verses to choose as memory verses. Only there's a problem in that, is that they tend to be lifted out of their context. And I don't know if, I know I'm a grammar geek. I do not repent of it. But has it ever bothered you that he says, present your bodies, plural, as a singular living sacrifice? That bothered me. It's not grammatically proper. It should be, present your bodies as living sacrifices, except when you drop it into its proper context. And I would like to suggest that he begins this particular passage this way as an introduction to how spiritual gifts are meant to function. Plural, bodies, but one living sacrifice. All of us together worshiping God through our actions, not just what we consider, pure worship, what we, sing and praise and pray, but in the way that we interact within the church. And of course, by extension, outside of the church. The thing is, verse 3 starts with the word, in my translation, in English, for, F-O-R, for, which is, of course, a sort of a conjunction, sort of connecting. But in the Greek, it's actually stronger. The Greek word gar underneath that indicates that what follows is going to be some sort of an explanation or an expansion of what was just said. So if you go back to, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, do not be conformed, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, he's now going to explain or expand on that by saying things like, by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. For as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function, so we, though many, are one body in Christ, and individually members of one another. Having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. If prophecy, in proportion to our faith, If service, in our serving. The one who teaches in his teaching, the one who exhorts in his exhortation, the one who contributes in generosity, the one who leads with zeal, the one who does acts of mercy with cheerfulness. Now, this idea of each of us having received gifts is a tricky topic to approach with people because they tend to, how shall I say this gently? They tend to think of what you receive as something you either use on yourself or something that you wave over other people's heads saying, look at what I have. And that is not what these gifts are for. So, of course, he starts with, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. And there are people who will say, well, that's how much faith you have. But that word measure is actually a concept of a standard of measurement. Like, say, you have a 12-inch ruler, or you have a yardstick, or more confusingly, a meter stick, which aren't the same thing. What always confused me as to how people were able to build in ancient times is the concept of the cubit, right? Distance from elbow to finger. It's different for every person. So how on earth were they able to get together and build something? Still bothers me. But we are not left with that sort of, well, it could be this for you, it could be that for me. We are left with the measure of faith that God has assigned. So he sets up a standard measurement of what our faith is. And this is what we are to measure ourselves by, which is important when we talk about each of us having different functions, because it means one function is not more important than another, which blows our mind because we're so used to prioritizing. Well, when we get down to the bare minimum, we absolutely have to have this. So that can kind of go by the wayside. In a lot of life, you have to live that way. In the church, you can't. So let's look at this idea of gifts, right? The word we're looking at in Greek is charisma, or in plural, charismata. And that comes from the word charis, which is grace. So these gifts are tied inseparably to God's grace, which means the gifts are independent of any consideration of merit. Again, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought. It isn't that God said, oh, you look especially promising, I'm going to give you that gift. He didn't. He just said, this is what I want you to do. And of course, he didn't say, oh, well, you're just lucky to be here, aren't you? You can have that one. That'll do for you. He just said, this is what I want you to do. And that's how we need to approach this, with particular emphasis on the idea of doing. Because implied in this word charismata, as I was reading different sources on this, is the idea of an endowment. Now, if you've ever worked for a nonprofit or a not-for-profit, you probably have heard of endowments, where someone donates resources to support a certain function. They might endow a chair position at a college. They might endow a particular type of research. It's a resource given to support a function. And that is also an important way we need to think of spiritual gifts, that God gives us certain resources to support an action. And having said that, then, right, when we look at this list, remember, Paul never gives what he considers a definitive list of what these spiritual gifts are. He always uses a selection of them for whatever original purposes he had in addressing his original audience, right? And the lists change. Last week we looked at one that was primarily leadership roles. Today, what do we have? We have prophecy, that overlaps. Service, teaching, that overlaps. Exhortation. Now that's not a word we use very commonly, but it has a sense of comforting people, of encouraging them, of kind of urging them along the way with you. And there are people who have a positive gift for encouragement. I wish I were one of those people. I don't. But contribution. Some people have a knack for handling finances. They make money and they donate money with the same ease, if you will. And of course, leadership, just in general, those who lead. Have you ever been sort of caught up in someone else's enthusiasm? That's a leadership gift. And he ends with something called acts of mercy. Now, we might think about that as, service, but we've already mentioned service. Do you know of people who are always seeking for other people better things than they deserve? To show them mercy. Some people have a gift for that. And his purpose in this particular list is to give a sort of a sprinkling of them and to say, whatever you have, use it in accordance with its nature. It's the principles, not the lists, that are important. And now this is a partial list that covers a lot of areas, but it's bookended in a peculiar way, right? You notice at the front, you have humility and grace. And afterward, at the end, you have let love be genuine, abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good, love one another with brotherly affection, and outdo one another in showing honor. So you have this end bookend of love, goodness, affection. And that also is an important principle we need to keep in mind when we're talking about spiritual gifts, because we need to begin with grace and humility and follow it up with love, with a desire for goodness, rejection of evil, and a willingness to honor one another. Do you notice how those match? Humility and a willingness to honor somebody else other than yourself. Let's turn over to 1 Corinthians 12. Another one of those that often gets lifted out of its context. In this instance, right, when we're looking at Romans, who was Paul talking to? He was talking to a church that he hasn't actually met in person, but he wanted to communicate to them his gospel. This is what he preaches. And this is a little different. This is a church he knows very well that is having a serious problem. They are elevating certain gifts above others and using these gifts almost to pull apart their fellowship. So you'll notice when Paul talks about the gifts in this context, he lays a heavy emphasis on the fact that there may be a multitude of gifts, but there is only one giver. This concept of diversity in unity. And you'd think, well, you can't have those two together, but Paul begs to differ. You'll notice if you look at verse 4 of 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Now, there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are varieties of service, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who empowers them all in everyone. Do you hear that rhetorical repetition? Varieties, but one, same. Varieties, but the same. Varieties, but the same. And it's a Trinitarian sameness. The unity that we are, of course, we talked about this a few weeks ago, that we are to pursue is the same unity that is in the Trinity, where there are, right, three persons, but one God. And so Paul approaches this in what I think is actually a really helpful way in modern terms also. Verse 7 particularly, to each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. There are two elements in that I really want you to notice and focus on. The first one is the manifestation of the Spirit. Now, these gifts are not something that was dropped right on our laps and then just left there. They are actually a manifestation of the Spirit living within you. So without a Spirit-led life, there are no spiritual gifts. It is, if you will, the overflow of the Spirit working within you. And the second part that I want you to notice and really pay attention to is why? For the common good. Now, I found a quote in one of Warren Wiersbe's commentaries where he says, spiritual gifts are tools to build with, not toys to play with or weapons to fight with. Now, if you think about it, some people will treat spiritual gifts as something to please themselves with, something to make themselves feel better, to reassure themselves about, their importance in God's plan, something like that. I never quite understood it. But some people will use them almost combatively, like, I have this, and that makes me important, or that means you have to listen to me. But the point is, the manifestations of the Spirit are given not for the individual, but for the fellowship of all. And in this list, the emphasis is definitely on the Spirit's role in the endowment of these gifts. And you almost hear this unspoken implication of it's the Spirit who gives this thing. It's not you. It's the Spirit who bestows, not you. Because the audience he's talking to originally is having a serious problem with this idea that it isn't all about them. Does that sound familiar? But the individual is not ignored here. Far from it. As Paul goes through this list, it's clear that the Spirit manifests differently through different individuals. There is an unusual amount of respect given to the individual who is given for the group. And that leads into this concept that we belong to one another. And we start in verse 12, right? He starts to develop more fully this metaphor of the church as one body with many members, right? Now, one of the funniest things to watch about a very, very young baby is watching them discover what all of these bits do. And how many can I get in my mouth? And where, it's like, what can I do with all of this? This is a wonderful journey of discovery. Now, of course, as you get older and more at home in your body, you start to have other discoveries that are of a less pleasant nature, like I didn't know I could hurt there. Or how long has that been there? Or has that always looked like that? And there are, I mean, you think about how many specialties there are in medicine, because you have different specialists that focus on different parts of the body. Paul approaches spiritual gifts very much in that manner. After he finishes talking about the lists of gifts themselves, that's in verses 8 through 11. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But he talks about this one body and many parts, and the fact that they are inseparable. No one part can deny any of the others or separate itself from any of the others. He says, if the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would be the sense of hearing? If the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? Of course, you can use the old, really, really old gag. If the whole body were an ear, how would it smell? Terrible. But it would be ridiculous to think of a human body all as one part. It would be ludicrous. We know from experience, familiarity, that it is extremely necessary that a body has many parts. And the church has to have many parts. And none of the parts can say, well, I'm done with this, I am leaving. You know what happens when parts of your body leave the whole. They cease to be parts of your body. And they cease to live. But then you can't have one part of your body saying, I don't need that bit, I can handle it myself. And I have to say, this is one of those things that I myself have a temptation toward. But, I'll just do it. But we are put together with many functions in order that no one person has to do it all. Now, of course, every congregation that you will visit will have a core of people who do, say, what is it? They say 10% of the congregation doing 90% of the work. But they are not all the same, even in that situation. And of course, in that situation, you seriously need someone with the gift of encouragement because you get tired when you don't have enough people with enough functions. And there are parts, right? This is one of those things where we're like, I think maybe we should stop pressing this metaphor quite this far. When he talks about parts of the body that we think less honorable, we bestow the greater honor on them. And our unpresentable parts are treated with greater modesty. Now, obviously, you can only take this so far. Don't go around saying, oh, yes, you're the unpresentable part of the body. It doesn't work like that. But when you remember, he's talking to the church in Corinth where they're saying, well, this gift is so much more important. That one is just kind of, meh. You can't say that because the humbler appearing functions are often the more necessary. And of course, if you look at the book of 1 Corinthians as a whole, you will find that what they had been doing was giving honor to the more spectacular gifts, particularly speaking in tongues. But Paul makes a very, very strong point in here that that particular gift is one of the least useful ones and honestly can't be used in the body without someone else having a gift of interpretation. Excuse me. Whereas if you look back at the list, right, he talks about wisdom and knowledge, faith, healing. That one in particular is kind of like gifts of, and it doesn't work in English, so they haven't translated it this way, but it's literally gifts of healings, different kinds of healing, sometimes physical, sometimes spiritual or emotional, and others working of miracles or prophecy or the ability to distinguish between spirits, different kinds of tongues and the interpretation of tongues. There are a lot of different things that the body needs in order to function. And the humbler ones, gifts of service, acts of mercy, encouragement, are the ones that you really miss when they aren't there. And the pain of one part of the body belongs to the whole body. The honor of one part is shared by all. I mean, I don't know if you've ever slammed your hand in a door, but there is a sensation that sweeps over your whole body when you do that. It's not just your fingers. And I don't know if you remember if, that one particular special person first took hold of your hand and the rest of you got all tingly, because it's not just the hand. We are not separated from one another. And I find it interesting that he ends this after so much emphasis on, the Spirit is the one who does this. If you look at verse 11, he's like, all are empowered by one and the same Spirit who apportions to each one individually as he wills. Or verse 18, as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each one of them as he chose. So he gives us heavy emphasis on this is how God is doing what he wants to do through us. This is not all about us. And also about how we are inseparable. No one can stand apart from the others. And he talks about, God appoints, right? And he gives kind of a summary of lists of things that people are doing. And he says, are all of this, are all that? No. But, this is how he ends this particular passage, earnestly desire the higher gifts. Now, given what he has said so far, which sorts of gifts would you think he's talking about as higher gifts? I suspect he is talking about the ones that serve to build up the church body. So, no one person possesses all functions, and all individuals don't share the same function. And we're to want the Spirit to manifest through us in the form of these gifts, these functions. But what does he say immediately after this? I will show you a still more excellent way. And if you've been in the church for any amount of time, you might know what this is leading up to. Another passage that gets lifted out of its context. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Did you ever notice that he is recapping the spiritual gifts here? I know I didn't, not until I started looking at it all. as one unified passage. In Romans 12, he just bookended it with saying, love one another. I guess here he felt like he needed something a little bit stronger to persuade them that if the gifts of the Spirit are not supported and motivated by what you might say the fruit of the Spirit, by love, they're useless. They're worthless. So we need to keep that in mind. Bodies, plural, as a singular living sacrifice, together. Apportioned, appointed by God, accepted and acted upon by us. That basically, in a nutshell, is the spiritual gifts.